On Primetime Politics tonight, victims of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces finally get an apology from political and military bosses. But does it go far enough? And does it signal real commitment to change? I'll speak with this survivor of sexual assault in the military about the importance of this day and the ongoing efforts to build a new culture. On the eve of the fiscal update, the finance minister gives new direction to the Bank of Canada to make job creation a priority in the battle against rising inflation. This expert will explain the significance of the shift in the central bank's mandate and what it will mean for Canadians. And the fiscal update will also include $40 billion for legal claims and reforms related to the Indigenous child welfare system. Our panel of parliamentary journalists looks ahead to the fiscal update and more. But we'll begin tonight with a long-awaited apology for the abuse and suffering faced by victims of sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. 3 separate apologies, in fact, acknowledging the failure to build a Canadian Armed Forces that is inclusive and safe for the women and men who serve this country, acknowledging the abuse of power by military leaders and the failure to act and the betrayal of successive federal governments. So far, more than 18,000 survivors and victims have filed claims as part of a $900 million settlement with the government over military sexual misconduct. In a virtual event held today, apologies were issued by the Deputy Minister of National Defence, the Chief of the Defence Staff, and the Minister of National Defence.
I acknowledge the pain and trauma that so many have endured because the very institution charged with protecting and defending our country has not always protected and defended its own members. I apologize on behalf of the Government of Canada and on behalf of those elected officials who, throughout the history of the Canadian Armed Forces, had the responsibility to protect you and who failed to do so.
In our military, we must change our culture. We must build trust. There's no currency as difficult to earn or as easy to squander. It will take tangible actions to make real and lasting change. This time, we will not fail. This is my commitment to you.
Well, Major Donna Roguidel is the co-founder of the Survivors Perspectives Consulting Group of veterans who have all been affected by military sexual trauma, and she also created the military's Operation Honor training program for Western Canada. She will be taking her release from the military in March due to PTSD from sexual trauma. Major Roguidel, thanks first of all for taking time to speak with me this evening. Let me suggest you bring a unique perspective to all of this, in that you've been subjected to the misconduct and you have been trying to make change from inside the forces. So what is your reaction to the apologies you heard today?
I mean, in so many ways, I know it's going to sound strange because we've had Operation Honor. We've sort of been working on this issue for a while. It's certainly not the first time this has come to kind of the center stage, but the apology is really kind of the most important first step, right? This is the validating and normalizing, acknowledging the pain of the people that are out there and the people that are still suffering, and now sort of giving that opportunity to now move into the problem-solving space. So hopefully that's what people got out of it, was sort of a sense of, closure and everything else.
As you watched, did the apologies go far enough to acknowledge not just the misconduct, but how the military system, how the government failed to properly respond to the complaints? There was lots in the apologies about betrayed trust by some in the processes, including the military leaders. But was there enough about the failed responses by government and leaders who failed to listen or ignored or tried to cover up the wrongdoing?
I've been asked a couple of times today if there was enough atonement or anything else. And I said, well, nothing can atone for what we've been put through. I mean, I don't know a survivor that I can think of off the top of my head that wouldn't go back, obviously. And it doesn't undo anything. It doesn't unassault or unrape somebody. But at the same time, I know from my own personal experience, I was presenting a class last week and I had somebody from my own chain of command, my own past, come forward and apologize for missing the signs and not intervening and not, doing more to support and protect me. And that meant a lot. So I'm hoping that if there are survivors out there that haven't had that opportunity to engage, that this will mean that for them, that this will give them an opportunity to, feel like somebody's heard.
Yeah, and on the the one hand, this is meant to be a step forward. On the other hand, it can re-traumatize people who've been through the process. So I'm wondering what your sense is of how other survivors will respond to the apologies they heard today, and whether you think all or perhaps most of them are willing to accept apologies from the people responsible for so much hurt.
I think I think that there's a lot of trust that's eroded. These people were betrayed. We were violated by the very organization that we, had signed up to protect our country through and everything else. And these were our brothers and sisters in arms victimizing us. So I think that it's going to take a lot more than just an apology. But I think that that's first step. So I think a lot of us are kind of tentatively optimistic that maybe now we're on the right track, but it really comes down to, you've now acknowledged the pain and everything else, and we sure appreciate that, but now what's next? Like, are we really going to see change and new innovative ways to sort of address this? They keep talking about survivor-centered, trauma-informed. Great, let's see that.
Let me ask you in terms of what precisely was said today, just before we get to more about next steps. Survivors were listening for different things, about references to particular experiences and particular groups and particular individuals. Was there enough detail in the apologies today to recognize the wide scope of the failure that's occurred?
I think that for me personally, there were two things that I was listening for. One was an acknowledgement of families. So often we forget that, in being traumatized, we are not fully the parents that we could have been. We are not fully, the wives, the husbands, the brothers, sisters that we should have been, and that, our family members actually deserve. So I think that acknowledging that went really, really far. And the other part of it is, and I've said this to other people, survivors are not, generally speaking, broken by being assaulted or by being systemically harassed. It's more when you turn to, your family, which is at that point the CAF, and say, this terrible thing happened to me, how they support or don't support you. So, being kind of having turned their back on us or abandoning us, or even worse, sort of throwing you out, that cuts very deep. So that I'm glad that they acknowledged that they definitely did damage.
The minister pledged today that there will be change and that change is underway. How confident are you that that's true?
I know that change is possible because I see it when we do our training. I see it. I see people coming around to that new perspective and how amazing it is to see them finally grasp, how to make this happen. I want to see that more widespread. I want to, like in the Army, we say we want to see it down to the Army floor. We need to see it. It needs to be standardized across. And right now it's not. Some leaders are really engaged and really pushing change, and others are not. So we really need to make sure until we get to, the lowest rank that's only there part-time, then we haven't quite gotten it yet.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, the country's been living through this, clearly not the shared experience of survivors such as yourself, but this has been a big problem for a long time. It surprises me to hear you say that some leaders are not engaged in the process of change. How can that be?
Some are not. Like, I really, way back at the beginning when Operation R first started and I first did a training program, I remember being told flat out, we need a shorter one for those in command, because this isn't a problem that commanders contribute to. This is a problem only at the lower ranks. So if you think about it that way, really, they only became aware of the full horrible scope in the spring when everything was sort of coming down.
What would you like to see as sort of immediate next steps? The apology is a big one, obviously. The apologies, there were 3 today. What can be done next to really demonstrate, okay, this is moving?
I'd like to see them, again, be engaging with the survivor community and talking to us. Like, we have solutions. We have things that have been working. If you don't want to use our solutions, that's fine, but let us contribute to yours, because that survivor voice has been really missing from the education training piece, and it can't come from the organization because the organization controls that message. It needs to come straight from us. We need to be able to tell you where the gaps are that have hurt so many of us and how to better support and how to message us, because, nobody knows that better than somebody who's been through it. So really tap into that. We're standing at the ready to continue to serve and help fix the organization that hurt us. So let us do that, because it's so empowering.
All right, Major Donna Roguidel, thanks so much for your perspective this evening. Good to talk to you, and good luck with the next steps in your life after the military.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland will deliver the fiscal update tomorrow, but ahead of that, today she unveiled the new 5-year mandate for the Bank of Canada. central bank's responsible for overseeing Canada's monetary policy, including setting interest rates to keep inflation at around 2% at all times. But these days, of course, inflation's running at 4.7% and is anything but predictable. Today, Freeland renewed the mandate with the same primary focus on 2% inflation, while also directing the bank to make decisions aimed at achieving maximum employment.
In focusing on price stability, we also recognize that monetary policy should support maximum sustainable employment in Canada. When conditions warrant, the bank will use the flexibility of the framework to actively seek the maximum level of employment consistent with price stability, as it is already doing.
We are focused on bringing inflation back to target in a way that doesn't choke off this recovery. This agreement, this mandate enables us to do just that.
Pedro Antunes is the chief economist for the Conference Board of Canada. He joins me now. Mr. Antunes, good to see you again. What is the significance of this new mandate for the Bank of Canada that includes now looking at efforts to maximize employment when it takes steps to fight inflation?
Well, I mean, I think if you read the fine lines here, I don't think we're changing drastically the mandate of the Bank of Canada. We're still going to keep and target inflation at 2% within that 1 to 3% rate. Range. There is a little bit more wording and focus on keeping an eye on full employment, making sure the labor market is healthy. But I think the onus or the how should I say, the major weight of monetary policy will still be determined by inflationary pressures.
So in practical terms, what does this language change mean, do you think, for the way the bank makes decisions about how to deal with inflation?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it may, certainly in the current situation where we've just seen the labor market really on a tear in the last couple of months and, essentially back to a 6% unemployment rate nationally, which I would say is a fairly tight unemployment rate. I don't think it's going to change very much in the very short term, certainly. How the bank reacts in the future in different circumstances, I think we'll have to wait and see. Our sense from the announcement is that, not a whole lot will change in how the bank targets its changes in monetary policy going forward.
All right. So I'm guessing from your comments, you do not, I think some have suggested that it could be, but you don't view this as a watering down of the bank's focus on inflation and keeping it low.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think the Bank of Canada has always had an eye on what they call essentially, the closing the gap on the economy. And of course, that really is around labor markets and whether we are at full employment. I think that plays a major role. So I think that's always been part of the bank's objectives, even if they weren't spelled out so much so in the mandate. No, I think this is going to be kind of business as usual, and it certainly in our perspective from the Conference Board, we think this is a good thing. One of the ways, of course, that the bank maintains kind of its handle on inflation is by making sure that people believe and have their inflation expectations anchored. In other words, that they believe that the Bank of Canada will be successful in keeping inflation in that band and at 2%. So changing the mandate now, confusing the message around what the bank is targeting, et cetera, I think it would have just been bad timing in terms of where we are given the latest inflation numbers and just the expectations. We're very worried here that we may see inflation getting into these expectations, that is, getting into wages and then obviously putting pressure on prices in this kind of vicious cycle. That's what we want to avoid, and I think it was wise to keep the mandate where it is.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Is there a point where keeping inflation low and keeping employment high could become mutually exclusive?
Well, that's always a challenge. In fact, economists have something that they look at, which is this relationship between low unemployment rates and high inflation. And this is one of the things that is difficult for the Bank of Canada to manage. We've been very, very successful at managing that over the last 30 years, in essence. And that is, again, because inflation expectations, I feel, are anchored. So we're not seeing these pressures necessarily getting into wages. and driving up those, this kind of vicious or vicious cycle on prices. So no, I think it's essentially it's been a successful policy to date. I think it's wise to keep it where it is going forward. And of course, the bank, as you know, Peter, has a very limited policy measure. The measure that it has is, in essence, in normal times, certainly, is moving interest rates up and down. That's a very broad brush to take on in terms of trying to, how should I say, manage where the economy is and the economic cycle.
Right. What will it mean for consumers facing inflation running at an 18-year high? Do you believe this gives the Bank of Canada, as some perhaps have suggested, the leeway to bring down inflation, perhaps, or to try to bring down inflation more slowly than it might otherwise?
Well, I think the bank here is kind of stuck in this current situation. It is stuck in a bit of a difficult position because, I think there are a number of factors driving high inflation right now that are temporary. We've seen a shock to oil prices. We've already seen that come off somewhat, so that hopefully will play out in the numbers. We've seen this, and by the way, this is not just monetary policy. This is very much, fiscal stimulus. Most of the developed world has seen, household balance sheets in great shape through this recession, and that's driving up very, very strong demand, especially for goods. So that's been driving up, excessively strong demand for goods, products, that is causing problems on the supply chain. So that's another factor that hopefully will normalize as we see, essentially consumer spending coming off. We also have a situation with, essentially with lack of skilled workers. So that's another challenge in this current crisis. All of these things together have been driving inflation numbers up.
Okay.
Certainly for Canadians, this is essentially eroding a lot of that savings that we socked away back in 2020. It is concerning. Hopefully, we'll see those numbers getting tamer into the future.
Well, we expect to hear more about inflation and affordability issues in tomorrow's fiscal update. What in particular will you be watching for?
Well, I've got to say, and we just discussed, I think, the problems that we're seeing in terms of inflationary pressures here are not just because very soft monetary policy, very low interest rates, but also because of all the stimulus that's readily in the economy right now, both in terms of household balance sheets and businesses. So I think we are hopeful that we'll see the gas pedal ease up in essence in this economic update. Not too much, certainly not anything new in terms of new measures. We may still see some targeted programs because some industries, take transportation, tourism, are not going to be recovering very quickly, especially with the onset here of Omicron and more restrictions on travel and borders. But overall, what we're hopeful to see is less stimulus, right, especially up front, especially right now, and perhaps a better than expected fiscal situation. If some of the provinces, we've seen better numbers than we had originally planned for.
Right.
Right now the federal government over 2 years, $500 billion in deficits. Hopefully, we'll see some of that in better shape than we'd heard previously.
All right, lots to look forward to. Always good to talk to you, Pedro Antunes. Thanks for your time today, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, sir.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
We learned today that the fiscal update will set aside some $40 billion over 5 years for Indigenous child welfare reform and compensation. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations says roughly half of the money will be used to cover the cost of settling a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal order and several class action suits. The other $20 billion will go towards reforming the Indigenous child welfare system. The offer of money for the legal settlements is not a final agreement. Negotiations on that continue to a December 31st deadline to try and reach a deal.
We reflect on 30 years of failure and discrimination towards Indigenous children in the child welfare system, denials of service. This is 30 years of the cost of failure, and that cost is high. For the last 6 weeks, we have been at the negotiation table with Dr. Blackstock, with counsel to AFN, with AFN, under the guidance of Maurice Sinclair. hashing out a number of things. That portion of historic discrimination that has occurred on Indigenous children, and a reflection, and this is principally why Dr. Blackstock is at the table, on fixing the system once and for good. And what does that mean? Long-term investments into things necessary to stop the discrimination, to make sure we're not repeating the model that has ripped children from their families into care. That comes at a cost, and the reflection that we need to have on that is, what's the cost of inaction?
Time now to bring in our panel of parliamentary journalists. Tonda MacCharles is a parliamentary reporter with the Toronto Star. Joël-Denis Bellavance is the parliamentary bureau chief for La Presse. And John Ivision is a columnist and parliamentary bureau chief for Post Media. Tonda, let me start with you. The fiscal update will be out Tuesday, and that will include, we now know, $40 billion to settle the ongoing battle over child welfare compensation and a number of other class action suits, and to ensure reforms to Indigenous the child welfare system. I think it's about half and half, the minister said today. Still lots of questions about how the money will be spent precisely, but this will be another major spending announcement we're going to hear about in the fiscal update.
Right, and I think it's the first time that we've gotten, at least from the federal government, there have been various estimates over the years floating around about how many billions it would cost to ultimately settle this. But we don't, look, Mark Miller was out today basically saying, don't want to put the cart before the horse here. We still have to work out the details. This is not confirmation of a settlement, but this is the federal estimate of what to solve the big child welfare ruling out of the Human Rights Tribunal that they've been fighting over. Many Canadians have heard about it over the campaign, to settle that, and about 3 other class action lawsuits, and to build capacity on reserves to allow First Nations and Indigenous communities to offer their own child welfare services, and also to deal with principal demands for health services. But look, the thing that surprised me about this coming out today is that we had all been led to believe that the fiscal economic statement tomorrow was going to be no mini budget, no great big spending, no great big news in here, nothing to see here, folks. But that's big news. That's a big figure.
And makes me wonder, John, quickly to you, it makes me wonder here whether, that would have been a big sort of sticker shock thing, and if we'd all seen it for the first time in the fiscal update tomorrow. The timing's kind of interesting to sort of come out the day before, and is that an effort to sort of damp down the sort of sticker shock that people would see if they just saw it for the first time tomorrow?
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, when I saw that number, 40 billion, I had to do a double take on it. I mean, that's a big number for a government that had already announced $140 billion over 5 years in the budget, another $70 billion spending in their election platform. I mean, we're getting to a stage where the idea that post-pandemic spending was going to go back to some kind of normal. I don't think that we're going to see the typical program spending to GDP ratios around about 15%. That's what they were projecting in the budget. I don't think we're going to get there over the next few years, and it looks like big government is here to stay.
Joël-Denis, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what I do find interesting is that this news is leaking out today, just 24 hours before the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, is releasing her economic update. And just to put it in perspective, 40 billion is a huge number. And today, the Prime Minister and Karina Gould, the Minister for Social Development and Families, right. They announced a new deal with New Brunswick on daycare services, and that is a program over 5 years that will cost $30 billion, and that's if we sign a deal with every province. So that puts it in perspective. And I'm assuming the $40 billion that is being put aside will be accounted in this fiscal year that is ending on March 31st. So that means that the deficit will probably be higher because, as the Auditor General says, you need to put your expenses as soon as you encounter them. Yeah. So if it's put aside, it will all be accounted in this fiscal year.
Yeah, just as an aside, of course, the big holdout still the province of Ontario trying to get a child care deal that it still doesn't have. And one thinks Doug Ford probably wants that before an election in Ontario in June. But those talks still underway. Tonda, we finally got long-awaited apologies today for the decades of sexual misconduct in the Canadian military, and it came with a pledge that real change will come. That's a promise from the new minister. How optimistic do you think we should be that change is really coming to the Canadian forces?
Well, it might be a bit early to say. She's only been on the job 2 months, but only in 2 months she's done more than Harjit Sajjan did in 6 years. And that is to accept a recommendation to shift oversight of these cases from the military police themselves into the civilian realm. And look, I have the very strong sense that this is absolutely core to Anita Anand's goals in this portfolio. She wants to assert civilian leadership over the military. And that's not just, I don't think, in the realm of sexual assault cases. I think she's going to assert stronger civilian oversight over a whole range of military activity, including procurement. So I would say, watch, let's see how it plays out. But I expect that, this is only the beginning.
John, what are your thoughts on the apologies we heard today, apologies, plural, and the significance of those and maybe what comes next?
Well, I think these apologies are significant. I mean, in all the years I've been reporting, when people have been traumatized, it's equally as traumatizing as the actual event of trauma that the official response is not sensitive and caring. So I think this is a sign that it doesn't erase the trauma, but at least it doesn't add to it, and it maybe alleviates some suffering from survivors. I do think, though, there needs to be something of a rebalancing. I mean, at the moment, if you talk to senior officers, they're all just keeping their heads down. They feel the morale is terrible. There's a feeling that there are some good officers who've been accused of things. They're not able to defend themselves. The accusations are never made public, and everybody's being tarred with the same brush. So, at some point, the military needs to get back being the military and concentrate on the subject of defence, and maybe, with any luck, this apology helps on that process.
Yeah, it seems like there may be a long road ahead on all of this, Joël-Denis, but what are your thoughts? Were these apologies today meaningful, do you think, and what do you think of the minister's promise that real change is coming?
Well, after 2 months at the helm of the national defense, we should say that a lot of changes have happened under her leadership. And we're told that those apologies were planned even before the pandemic and during the pandemic started by the department, but they were not offered to the victims because of the pandemic. Well, we're still in a pandemic, and she decided, the minister, Antonin, to offer them just to turn the page on this very somber chapter of the Canadian Armed Forces. At some point in our history, one prime minister said, "Just watch me," when he was confronted with separatist issues in Quebec. Now, I would say for Anita and just watch her. I think she's determined to leave her mark in terms of being the first female in a long time from a female defense minister.
All right. We'll have to leave it at that for tonight. Thank you all. Appreciate the chance to talk to you again, and we'll be in touch soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
And that's all for this edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.